In this video, we introduce Paul's letter to the Romans, particularly looking at its historical context, its purpose or purposes, and various themes that are found within it. So by the end of this video, you should be able, in about a paragraph or so, to address some of those in your own words. The second objective for this video and for this unit is be able to look at particular Pauline passages, whether they be from Romans, Galatians, or another Pauline text, and apply one of the different three perspectives on Paul, whether that be the Lutheran perspective, the new perspective, or the radical new perspective on Paul, and sort of compare and contrast how a given perspective differs from the other perspective. So how one perspective would view a particular passage vis-a-vis the two other perspectives. And so sort of what we're going to do in this video with respect to Romans is going to give you some background information to be able to complete that second objective a little bit more successfully. So as to our course thesis, we are doing a deep dive on a particular text, and of course a text that is of monumental influence in Christian history, and particularly in Protestant Christian history. And so what I want to do, because Romans is such an influential text in the history of the church, what I want to do is start with your own knowledge of Romans. So what I want you to do is take about 5 minutes and do a data dump on what you know about Romans. And you can do this in whatever format you want. You could just do bullet points of things that come to mind when you think of Romans. You could do this in paragraph, more prose format. You can handwrite it or you can type it directly into the course notes. But I want you to spend 5 minutes sort of just priming your brain, recalling what you know about Romans so it's ready to go when I give you what I know about Romans. All right, so let's move from what you know to what I know and what I'm going to present to you here. We're going to start with the historical context of Romans. And one of the most important things to know about this letter is Paul is writing to churches that he did not found. So unlike Galatians, where Paul did found those churches, he had sort of apostolic authority. Paul is writing to a city that he did not found churches in. Though this is not to say that he doesn't know a lot of people in Rome. As we will see in just a moment, Paul has many contacts in Rome. Chapter 16 mentions about 30 different names. Some Paul seems to have a personal relationship with, and some of those names Paul seems to be acquainted with. And to get a sense of the city of Rome itself, so the destination to which the letter was sent to the churches that Paul did not found there. When we're thinking about Rome, we're thinking about one of the most populous ancient cities, probably somewhere around 500,000 to 1 million total people. So this is a very large city. Even by modern standards, this would be a fairly large city, but by ancient standards, it's almost absurd. When we're thinking about specifically Jews in the city of Rome, most estimates say that there's about 20 to 50,000 Jews in the city when Paul is writing Romans. It's going to be about 5% of the total population. And when we think of Rome, we think of Rome sort of in the context of the Greco-Roman world more generally, that it's going to be a very diverse environment, both with respect to religiosity, to the worship of multiple gods, but also ethnically, that Rome, the empire, had this tendency to sort of bring in different ethnicities to it. So, and when those different ethnicities were brought in, oftentimes the gods of those ethnicities were brought into sort of the Roman sphere of influence as well. So the city of Rome is particularly a hub, as urban centers often are, of diversity. And the last thing to note with respect to Rome is the tensions that were experienced between the Roman Empire, particularly in the city of Rome, and Jews more generally. So there's these Roman-Jewish tensions, sort of not only empire-wide that we've talked about previous in this class, that are ultimately going to come to a head in the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, but in the city itself, there are also particular Jewish tensions with the Roman citizens, with the Roman government, that are worth noting here. And so two dates are going to be of significance, and both have to do with the Emperor Claudius. So in 41 CE, Cassius Dio tells us that Claudius had banned Jewish synagogue gatherings. So here I'm going to read this because it's short enough. As for the Jews, who had again increased so greatly that by reason of their multitude, it would have been hard without raising a tumult to bar them from the city, Claudius did not drive them out, but ordered them, while continuing their traditional mode of life, not to hold meetings. He also disbanded the clubs, which had been introduced by Gaius. So what Cassius Dio is telling us here is that there was some sort of Jewish problems within the city of Rome, and oftentimes Jews and then later Christians become sort of scapegoats for the Roman Empire precisely because they don't worship the polytheistic God. So if there's a problem, oftentimes Jews and Christians become the first to blame because it's sort of thought that it's their fault, that the gods are reacting negatively to us because this group of people is not worshiping those gods, and so we're sort of losing favor with the gods. And so Dio tells us here that Claudius doesn't drive Jews out of Rome at this point, but he says they can't meet. They can't have synagogue meetings. And this appears to change in about 49 CE, so less than a decade later, where Suetonius tells us about the Edict of Claudius, where Claudius actually does take the next step and expels Jews from Rome. And we see this also mentioned in Acts 18:2, when Luke is telling us about Aquila, and that Aquila and Priscilla had been disbanded from Rome, or had been exiled from Rome under the Edict of Claudius. And so there's debate about how widely this kind of edict would have been able to be enforced in a city of 1 million people. Could Claudius really sort of send out all of the Jews? But it's very clear that something happened, and that there was some memory of Jews leaving Rome on account of what Claudius said around the year 49 or 50 CE. So this all sort of forms the background to about 10 to 15 years before Paul is writing the letter to the Romans. And as we're going to see in just a moment here, Jewish and Gentile relations are going to be one of the key themes in Romans. So Paul's writing to churches in Rome that he did not found. We've got a couple more bullet points here with respect to what's going on with Paul as he writes this letter. First, he tells the Romans that he is preparing a visit on to Spain. He's going to stop in Rome, visit the churches there, visit the people there, and then go on to Spain. Another important fact is that there's no co-sender listed at the beginning of Romans. If you remember back to Philemon, Timothy was mentioned as one of Paul's co-writers of the letter. This is not the case in Romans, despite the fact that Timothy is with Paul at the time. And it seems to be that this has something to do with the fact that Paul is really trying to present himself to the Romans. He doesn't want to present himself and someone else. He wants to present himself and his theology for one reason or another. And we'll see what some of those potential reasons are in just a moment here when we talk about the purposes of Romans. So, and as we said about this, the Edict of Claudius and the exile of Jews from the city of Rome, one result of this, and this seems to be played out in the language of Romans as well, and what Paul says in Romans, or what Paul indicates about his audience in Romans, is that this is primarily a Gentile audience, though also there are some Jewish Christians as well mixed in there. And we particularly get a hint of this with respect to Romans 9 through 11, where Paul spends a great deal of time talking about the fate of Israel given the Christ event. And so what I want to do here is give us a little bit more about the sort of social setting of the audience of Romans by way of the conclusion of Romans 16. Romans 16 is this part of the letter that really provides us unique insight into the people that were addressed, insofar as a number of people are named, but also we can sort of glean some demographic information based on the names of these people in Romans 16 and what Paul says about them, or what titles he appends to them. So what I've given you first here, and I'm not going to read this out loud. I ask you to pause and go ahead and read this papyrus letter. So we're hearkening back to something we've done before, reading papyrus letters. This is one of those everyday letters. This one from a son to his father. The son's not so happy about some actions his father has or has not taken. But at the end, what I have highlighted here, what I've underlined here, is the fact that this son follows the letter writing convention of sending greetings to different people. He says, I greet all our folk and also my teachers. Or he asks his father to pass these greetings along. And we see this also happening, not so much, I should say, in a letter to Theon, or from Theon to Tyrannus. In this case, not a lot of people are greeted. But what's interesting about this one with respect to Romans is that the letter carrier is commended, just as Phoebe, Paul's letter carrier, and it's not insignificant that Phoebe is a woman here, is commended. So in this case, in this letter, we have no greetings, but we have the commending of a letter carrier, just as we do in Romans 16:1 or 2. And the other thing I want to note here is that Theon calls Heraclides his brother, and it could very well be that he is his physical brother, but this is also a kinship, a fictive kinship term that that just as we in our modern context will refer to someone sort of affectionately as my brother, even if they are not one's blood brother. The same thing happens in the ancient world, and so I highlight this to sort of give the contemporary analog. This is not necessarily wholly unique to Christians, and it comes up in this letter here. When we look at Paul's conclusion, sort of in comparison to these other ancient letters, and then also in comparison with other Pauline letters, so comparing Romans 16 not only with other papyrus letters, but with things like Galatians 6, Philippians 4, 1 Thessalonians 5, and 1 Corinthians 16, we see that the conclusion to Romans is much different. It's much longer in particular than are these ones here. Again, I'm not going to read these. I encourage you to pause the video and just very quickly read how Paul concludes these other letters. And notice how when we come to Romans, it's much longer. That just even the number of words there are much greater, and then we have a number of different people, or a lot more people greeted in Romans chapter 16. And again, this might be because Paul is sort of trying to establish connections. He's trying to sort of call out all of the people he knows there, because he's really trying to drum up support. He's trying to get people to sort of come around him, and by calling them out and by name and greeting them, this might be a strategy to do that. But for our purposes, what's interesting about the names is that they sort of tell us certain things about the demographics of the churches in Rome. And I should note, I haven't said this yet, but when we talk about Paul's letter to the Romans, we're talking about a number of different congregations, not one single meeting of Christians, or not one single group of Christians in Rome, but probably around 5 to 8 or 10 different meetings of Christians. And so what I've given you here is I've just pulled out all of the names from Romans chapter 16, and also underneath them, when Paul tells us something about them, I've given you that information here. And I've highlighted a couple of these because I want to call attention to some things about them. So if we look over here to Phoebe, who is incredibly important for Romans, we see this not only in Paul's commendation of her in chapter 16 verses 1 and 2, but also in the titles he gives Phoebe. She's the letter carrier. He calls her a sister, using this term of fictive kinship, of affection, but then also a deacon, a diakonos, the word that we directly take into our English vocabulary for deacon. And then Prisca and Aquila, a sort of power missionary couple, a male and a female, that the church meets in their house. So once again, we have a female figure along with a male figure being sort of a leader in the church in Rome. And then this is also going to be the case with Andronicus and Junia, another one of these sort of missionary power couples of Paul's. But Paul is going to call them apostles. So a male apostle and a female apostle. And then we have those in the Lord in Narcissus's family. Narcissus, there's some there's some thought that Narcissus is sort of a higher class figure based on his name and based on some other sort of historical findings that I'm not going to go into there, but it's notable that this sort of trends the social standing of the audience of Romans upward slightly. That it's that we have at least in the case of Narcissus, a figure who's of some importance as far as social standing goes. And then with respect to a couple other figures, we have quite the opposite with names like Tertius and Quartus. These names are literally 3 and 4 respectively. And oftentimes these kinds of names that are simply numbers are the names of slaves or former slaves. So we've talked previously in this course about slaves and freed persons. So what this suggests is also that we have people that are sort of a lower social standing than would someone like Narcissus, or also here Erastus, who is a city treasurer. So we have sort of, when it comes to the scope of the church in Rome, we have a lower to middle class setting for the figures that are mentioned here. And so I say that right here, that we have slave or freedman and freedwoman. We have those who are sort of in authoritative roles, but we also have those who appear to be of a slightly higher social standing. And then I've broken down also here the demographics of those who are mentioned in Romans. And this is not to say that we can sort of map these particular people that are mentioned and then push that out to the entirety, the entire audience of Romans. But what we can do is say that at least among those who are mentioned, we might be able to sort of extrapolate some ideas of what at least the important figures in the Roman churches, or the ones that Paul mentions, what their demographic information is. So we see that Paul greets 27 males and 9 females, but when it comes to the leadership roles, and where Paul gives titles for persons in Rome, it's very interesting that he has sort of 9 leadership type titles, and 6 of these belong to women and only 3 of them belong to men. Based on some of the other information we get in there, based on the ethnicity of the names, or this is a bit of a sticky point because we can't directly equate a name with a certain ethnicity. But there are 6 names here that are more typically Jewish names, and there are 30 names that are more typically non-Jewish names. So this goes back to this idea that we have a mostly Gentile audience, though with also some Jews as a minority of the audience to Romans. And then also based on what Paul says about these different figures, 8 appear to be in a closer relationship to him, whereas the other 28 or so are more like acquaintances. And so to extrapolate from this sort of demographic data, and as well as pulling some things from the entirety of Romans, what we find with respect to Gentiles or Christians and Jews in Rome, the first thing to note is that Christianity is an intra-Jewish movement. So I've said this several times, and I'll continue to remind you of it, is that when we think of Judaism and Christianity in Paul's context, in the New Testament context, we shouldn't necessarily think about Christianity as one thing and Judaism as something totally separate, that there's much more intertangling here. We do better actually to separate out Gentiles and Jews, Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. That is, those who ethnically were born and raised Jewish, and those who were ethnically not born and raised Jewish. And for Paul's movement, and for the early Christian movement generally, Gentiles are being sort of brought into a Jewish movement to be able to worship the Jewish God. That according to Paul's gospel, Gentiles don't have to sort of convert to Judaism altogether. They don't have to do things like be circumcised and able to worship the Jewish God. And so when Paul writes to Romans, he's writing with these things in mind, but he's also writing to a very small and a specific subset of God-worshiping communities in Rome. So you remember back to one of the first slides on the demographics of Rome in particular, we said there's probably some 20 to 50,000 Jews in Rome at the time Paul is writing. Paul is not writing to all 20 or 50,000 Jews in Rome. He's writing to a much smaller subset of Jews and of Christians that are part of his movement and are part of the early Jesus movement. And so, as I said earlier, we're probably talking about 5 to 10 house tenement churches with about 10 to 40 people per church. So, on the low end, we're talking Paul is addressing about 400 people in his audience of Romans. And on the lower end, if we have 5 house churches with 10 people, we're only talking 50 people. It's probably more closer to the middle of that range or the higher end. And then again, these based on the demographic information that we sort of pull out from these names, it appears that names and titles, it appears that Paul is addressing sort of lower to middle class groups in Rome. Also, with respect to the historical context of Romans and Paul, that we have Paul writing what might be his last letter. So this depends on whether one accepts the pastoral letters, that is 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, to be written from Paul or not. If they are written by Paul, then Romans is probably not Paul's last letter. But if they are not written by Paul, then Romans is probably Paul's last letter. And we get this not only from the sense of what happens in Acts, and Acts having Paul go to Rome at the end of his ministry, and sort of Acts ends there, but also by the fact that we have this sort of developed theology in Romans. Paul really takes what he says in a number of other letters and sort of expands it out in sort of this accordion fashion where he gives a lot more information about his theology in Romans. And a lot of people sort of presume that's because he's really developed his thinking, or he's developed his theology about the relevance of Jesus for Judaism and for his theology as time has progressed. And lastly, so if it's probably one of Paul's last letters, it's probably written from the city of Corinth. And this is primarily based on Romans 16, 22, and 23, and 1 Corinthians 1, 14. So when Paul is writing to the Corinthians in Corinth, he says that he thanks God that he baptized no one except Crispus and Gaius. And so what we have here is sort of 2 names of people we know who are residents of Corinth and who are in Paul's movement, in the early Jesus movement in Corinth. And then Tertius at the end has a greeting from Gaius to the Roman Christians. And so this suggests that Gaius is there with Paul, with Tertius, and sends along his greetings to the Roman Christians. And so this tells us that Paul is probably writing Romans while he is staying in Corinth. So as to our purposes and themes of Romans, one of the things that we have to think about when we think of the purpose in particular of Romans is paying attention to the fact that this is Paul's longest letter. So this is sort of one of the litmus tests for determining what Paul is trying to do. That is to say, if you're going to choose a purpose, or if you're going to say why Paul wrote the letter, one of the things that purpose should be able to do is explain why this is such a long letter in comparison to Paul's other letters. So you see here in canonical order the Pauline epistles that roughly correspond to the length of the letter. And so this is how canonically Paul's letters were organized, was largely by length. So you see, I give you over on the side that the average length of a Pauline letter is 2,481 words. The letter to Romans is not quite 4 times as large as that, but close to that. So much longer than Paul's average letter. And so here I've given us all of the different sort of possibilities for Paul's purposes, as well as some of the themes that come out in Romans. So what we find is that with Romans being Paul's longest letter, Paul really clarifies, and as I said, sort of in this accordion style, presents his theology to the Roman Christians. And it appears that he's developed this theology, and he's also sort of nuanced his position, particularly on the Jewish law, from what he has portrayed in Galatians. So we saw in Galatians chapter 3 how Paul doesn't, it doesn't appear that he paints the Jewish law in the best light in that chapter. And that may be because of his rhetorical purposes. It may be because the audience of Galatians is almost wholly Gentile, and that's not the case for Romans. But whatever the case might be, Paul has given more nuance in Romans, not only by the length, but also by what he says about things like the Jewish law. Some of the foci in Romans are going to be God's impartial faithfulness and mercy. And by impartial faithfulness and mercy, I mean that God has mercy upon Gentiles and upon Jews. That one is not better off, according to Paul, for being born ethnically a Jew. That both Gentiles and Jews are under sin, and both can worship the Jewish God. Paul also addresses real or potential objections to his theology in Romans. So one of the things that Paul will often do in this letter is he'll present objections to his theology in the voice of an interlocutor or in the voice of someone else. And then we'll respond to those objections in a way that sort of he covers himself theologically and he sort of explains away these potential objections that one might have to his theology. And the reason for this is probably related to the purpose of Romans, whatever one takes it to be. And there's a couple different options that I've presented here. One is to really focus on the historical and the social circumstances in the city of Rome. And this is here, this Jewish and Gentile relations in Rome. So under this theory, Paul is writing to Rome really to work out what's going on with Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians, particularly two groups that he's going to call the strong and the weak. So behind all of this, again, stands that edict of Claudius that potentially expelled a number of Jews from Rome, which sort of gave Gentile Christians an upper hand in the city of Rome. They became the prominent and the dominant group amongst the early church in Rome. And so Paul is really writing to make sure that sort of Jews and Gentile Christians get even treatment in these churches. So that's one of the possible purposes. Another is that Paul is seeking financial support, that he lays out his theology in order to be supported by the churches in Rome. That any good missionary is going to tell you what they think, what they believe, how their beliefs align with your beliefs before they ask for the money, that they want to sort of get on the same page. So by the fact that Paul explicitly says that he's seeking financial support, some extrapolate from that really the whole letter is an explanation of Paul's theology so that he can then ask for that financial support towards the end of the letter. We also have this focus on ethics in Romans 12 through 15, and this is sort of both a theme and a purpose simultaneously, and this is often called the indicative and the imperative, or I should say Romans 12 through 15, the ethics bit is often called the imperative, the command part of Romans, whereas Romans 1 through 11 is often called the indicative part of Romans. It's sort of laying out Paul's theology and then how one ought to live in response to that theology. So the indicative is the things that are indicated, the things that are real, and then the imperatives are the commands, the ways of living based on that theology or based on what Paul has said in earlier chapters. And so then the question is, where do we really see sort of the center of Romans? What are the chapters that are most important? And depending on where one weights these chapters, this is going to sort of affect what one finds the central purpose of what Paul's central purpose is in Romans. So this is roughly divided into 4 different categories. Romans 1 through 8 has sort of classically been the weighted portion of Paul's letter to the Romans. And this is sort of the chapters that get the most emphasis, particularly in Protestant Christianity. And these really have to do with this theology of justification, whether it's individual justification, how an individual sinner is justified in the eyes of God, or how Gentiles and Jews as groups are justified respectively. And this, whether one takes it more as an individual sense or as a more communal corporate sense, is going to depend on one's perspective on Paul and what Paul is more concerned with. If Paul is concerned with the individual or with groups. And then Romans 9 through 11, if one puts sort of their chips on those chapters, saying Paul is laying out this theology of justification so that he can address the place of Israel sort of in God's eyes in Romans 9 through 11, then Romans 9 through 11 becomes the center. And really there you get more of this sense of Paul's sort of communal idea of justification, and Paul is really writing to work out those any problems there might be between Gentile and Jewish Christians in Rome. And then Paul also mentions these factions and this judgmentalism. He talks about the strong and the weak, and these seem to be real groups of people in Rome, according to Paul. And so if you really sort of focus in on the strong and the weak, on these sort of factions and judgmentalism on both sides in both of these groups, then Paul has laid out not only his theology of justification, not only the place and also the place of Israel, in order to say, because of all this, because of everything that's been said in chapters 1 through 11, these factions and this judgmentalism just can't stand. It just doesn't work. You have to live differently as a result. And then, of course, if one thinks Paul is really writing all this stuff to make sure that he sort of lays out his theology for the Christians there for financial support, then that weight would be on Romans 15, 22 through 23. And that's not to say that by laying out his theology, it doesn't matter to Paul or it's not important to Paul because he's going to make a financial ask. Doesn't mean these things aren't true to him, but it means that they are sort of Paul presenting himself in a certain way so that not only he can get financial support, but so the congregations are ready for him when he comes to visit Rome, as he says he wants to do, and then for them to send him off further to Spain, and that Rome will be sort of the hub or the place that Paul can look back to in the East as he continues to move his ministry westward.